I'll be introducing this panel in Arabic in case you need headphones for translation. The next panel is بمسمى مساحات ثقافية وبناء المجتمعات. يتمحور الفن حول الإنسان ويتفاعل مع المجتمع والنسيج العمراني والمجتمعي. في هذه الجلسة نستكشف كيفية إنشاء مساحات ثقافية داخل النسيج العمراني أو خارجه. ماذا يستلزم ذلك؟ ما هي التحديات وكيف يتم التعامل مع المشاركة المجتمعية وخلقها؟ ستدير الحوار الاستشارية الفنية زين مسعود، ويشارك فيه كل من لوتشو فريغو ممثلا هي جاكس، وأنطونيا كارفر ممثلة لفن جميل، ودكتور براديب شارما ممثلا لمؤسسة سلمى بنت حمدان آل نهيان، وسايمون كاستيه ممثلا للمعهد السويسري للفن المعاصر في نيويورك، والأستاذ محمد حافظ ممثلا لمؤسسة الفن للجميع الغير ربحية. Enjoy the talk.
مساء الخير جميعاً. Good evening everybody. It is such a pleasure to join you all in celebrating and experiencing the inaugural and historic edition of the Diriyah Biennale. I'd like to extend our congratulations to the curatorial and Biennale Foundation teams on this Goliath labor of love and intelligence, and to thank them for hosting and to thank Raneem for inviting us for this rich public program and our discussion today. Museums and cultural institutions have historically been top-heavy, didactic environments, in many cases vestiges of colonial hierarchies and instruction. The potential of cultural spaces as civic spaces and the significance of developing community within them is a more recent priority, and particularly in our region, where we are laying the foundations for so many new cultural models and initiatives. There is a unique opportunity to set new precedents authentic to where we are. It's a critical moment to reflect on how cultural spaces can develop participatory, experimental models, asking questions, welcoming exchanges, rather than imposing all the answers. Creating spaces of empathy for variety of experience and opinion. I'm joined here this evening by stalwart figures in art and culture who, with their institutions and their work, have long been invested in developing nimble, relevant models for cultural institutions that serve their publics and communities. This commitment is not a given, it's a deliberate and special approach. And for our audience members who are not yet familiar with your organizations, perhaps we can begin by sharing a little bit more about these respective institutions that you serve. And as we are on home territory celebrating the Biennale at Jax, can I invite Lucio to tell us a little bit more about this special place where we're located today?
Thank you, Zain. Good evening. Can you hear me clearly? Yes, okay. So first of all, I would like to start with a big thanks to His Highness Prince Badr to having behind this and to have an incredible vision that brought us here. Also to the team on the Ministry of Culture that is here, and actually to Nouf, to Jane, Lina, Abdullah, I'm sure I'm forgetting Mashahel, Princess Arij, and all the team that is behind this. And also to an unsung hero that is not here today, which is Abdulaziz Al-Aissa, which is a very great friend, but also someone that is behind this. Without him, this would not be possible. So he doesn't like publicity, but I would really like to thank him. Now, so first of all, I'm here as a cultural developer, focused on developing cultural infrastructure. I serve at the Ministry of Culture, advising on all and many projects across the kingdom. And JAX is one of these projects that we started developing just 10 months ago. I would like to really stress this. 10 months ago, and we worked with an incredible Biennale team and with our Ministry of Culture team, and we're able to have you all of you here tonight. Thank you.
Perhaps we can invite our guest all the way from New York, Simon, who's the director of the Swiss Institute, to tell us a little bit about what you do all the way over there.
Thank you, Zain, and thank you to everyone at the Diriyah Biennial for inviting me, and congratulations for an incredible exhibition. Swiss Institute is in New York. It was created in 1986 as an independent, non-for-profit space for international contemporary art. So everything that we do is free of charge, and we're known to give a platform for either emerging or under-recognized artists.
And Pradeep, I mean, and really what I should be asking you is not only about your organizations, but how your locations have been have influenced your programming and how you've structured your models.
So my name's Pradeep Sharma. I'm currently the Director of Arts Culture Heritage at the Sheikh Salama Foundation, Abu Dhabi. And I have lived and worked in, I think, 23 countries in my time. And so that sense of location is kind of really important. So the reason I moved to Abu Dhabi was to try and grow an arts community, to try and help really sort of take art seriously and help people take their art seriously. And so one of the things we've been working on is how artists build a lifelong practice. And the way you build a lifelong practice in New York is significantly different to the way you do it in Abu Dhabi, significantly different to the way you do it in Auckland, Hong Kong. And so that sense of place does become really important, the dynamics and also the cultural things that you tap into. So some things that make me curious about being in a place with multiple identities, people dealing with issues of displacement are the same if you're Maori or if you're Native American or if you're Palestinian. So I think there's some really interesting human dynamics that kind of inform the way you engage with each other. And so that notion of working together has always sort of fascinated me, and being in Abu Dhabi now and seeing how we're all in the GCC, but we're all so different. The accents are different, the little words and take-ups are different. And so I just sort of see myself as an accent picker-upper.
That's such a beautiful way of looking at it, and I think it's so people finding a place for their identities in different spaces, finding a place where they can be themselves is so critical to that sense of belonging and capacity for community building. Antonia, there's been a watershed moment in Jeddah after many, many years of work and care, but of course you work between Dubai, Jeddah, and many geographies with Art Jamil. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Well, thank you. And just adding to my fellow speakers on the panel, just to say thank you so much for inviting us here to the Diriyah Biennial Foundation. And yeah, what a moment to be in Saudi for us all to be together here witnessing it. It's really something, feels very seismic, like a real shift taking place. So really thrilled to be here. Yeah, Art Jamil was founded in 2003 alongside Community Jamil, but the Jamil family, who are from Jeddah, have been involved in philanthropy for 75 years. This is their 75-year anniversary. So, you know, I think that there's not a better way to be able to celebrate that than establishing an institution in their own hometown of Jeddah. We worked a long time as more of a kind of agency model, working with other organizations to try and further our aims, and then eventually came to having physical institutions in 2018 with the opening of Jamil Arts Center in Dubai, and now with Hi Jamil, which is 5 days old, so a very young baby, just beginning to be brought up in Jeddah. So just picking up on what you were saying and what Pradeep was saying also about really trying to create resources and institutions that are bespoke to those cities. I mean, in Dubai, we felt that there's obviously an arts infrastructure there. There's the market, there are galleries, there's an art fair, there's everything that's happening in Sharjah and the institutional or grand scale museums in Abu Dhabi. But there was no kind of mid-scale institution that could be flexible, that could really try to nurture artists from this region and then pair them with other artists from elsewhere, and no visual arts library. So that became our kind of real kind of touch point for Dubai. And then in Jeddah, obviously you see this incredible creative community throughout the city working across many, many different disciplines. You have a very strong commercial gallery. You have the Saudi Art Council, who've been a big topic today in 2139. So thinking about what can we add to that, it felt appropriate to really think of a kind of multidisciplinary creative hub that could bring together institutional practices that we provide at Art Jamil, so High Arts, a kind of institution, 2-floor exhibitions venue, Saudi's first independent cinema, so again kind of trying to be very responsive to the needs of Saudi and the city, and seeing that commercial cinemas were coming, but there wasn't necessarily a place for Saudi filmmakers to nurture their work and to show independent cinema from around the world. So cinema became a primary kind of focus for us. And then artist studios and high learning, which is a kind of itinerant, informal, responsive art school, which we can provide for the community. And then high residence, who are creative businesses from Jeddah, including Athar Gallery, which is very much a partner in this venture. And then the final sort of element of that development is this idea of high community. So picking up on what you were saying, Zain, it's become really apparent to us that one of the big kind of movements of museum and instituting, if you like, in this age is to try and really flip audiences from being passive consumers of what they see in front of them and kind of, taking in visual imagery, and to turn those kind of audiences into active participants in a program. And early on, when we were 6 years ago thinking of building Hai Jamil and working with YY, the architects on it, we had a meeting with Mohammed Jamil and Fadi Jamil and said, how will we know if what we're doing is being successful? And the messaging from the family was, you'll know it's successful when the community feels they own it, and it's almost kind of running itself in response to the community, and the community are driving the agenda themselves. So we're really trying to flip that model of a kind of top-down in which the audiences absorb what's being presented to them, and really trying to turn that around and that they kind of create the narrative themselves. And that kind of inside-out model is something that we're really fascinated by in terms of pursuing going forward. I think there's too much to say, but
we're going to ask you more about many of the things you just touched on. But of course, Mohammed, you are an instigator on many different levels, and you've done so much for the scene that we now enjoy. But you're here in your capacity as vice chair of SAC. And can you tell us touch a little bit on the foundations of what you do?
Sure. Bismillah. First, I would like to thank the Biennale Foundation and everyone who's working behind this spectacular event. It has been an amazing 2 days. For some of us who's been involved with this for a decade or more, it's been very emotional. So, His Highness, the Minister of Culture, everyone that works in this realm has done so much in so little time, and it's only the beginning. We're so enthusiastic and excited about what's happening in Saudi today. Second point, I would like to invite our guests who are sitting there, that there are some empty seats on this side, so you don't have to be standing. But if you don't want to hear us for the whole hour, that's a good spot to be in. Sorry.
Keep your options open.
Yes. We're talking about SAC. So this SAC has been a response to a need and a gap in the scene. And I might take a couple of minutes to walk through some memories. And I think it was born after a lot of attempts to do things in town independently and individually, led by Her Royal Highness Princess Jawahir and the Mansouriya Foundation, the activities that they've been doing for many years. Edge of Arabia and its global tour that kind of came to Jeddah in 2012. And a lot of our friends here would remember that exhibition and the energy and the vibe that we all left with. And we were like, why is this a one-off? And this situation is so impactful, and we've seen engagements from all levels, and was a very interesting moment. So with the leadership and vision of Her Royal Highness, 15 art patrons and practitioners on different levels. So there are the collectors, the patrons, the professionals, the gallerists, and some of the members on the council are not even in the art world, but we all believed in the impact that art and culture discourse could bring to a city, a nation, and the exchange it can bring, not only between us and the rest of the world, but also amongst ourselves, generational conversations. And the example that we saw then at Edge of Arabia in 2012 got us thinking, how could this evolve into something sustainable? And what does our city need, and our people, our cultural users? And then SAC was born in a deserted shopping mall of some sorts. Like, we were looking for spaces, and maybe that's a kind of an unconventional decision of where to locate a cultural, I would say, institution. And yeah, that's us. No? Thank you. Zain, back to you. I can go on for longer, but I know that we have.
We're going to get into it.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I mean, it's interesting because, you know, Pradeep has touched on the multiplicity of communities that exist in any one place. It's very clear in a place like Dubai, this sort of transient, very cosmopolitan environment. Of course, you know, Jeddah, of course, is the most historic cosmopolitan environment to sort of transpose some of these ideas and see how they shift. And I wonder, and you touched on, you know, whether we can drive culture or whether we just sort of let it happen and let communities take charge. For both Lucio and Mohammed, and I mean all of you, whoever wants to chime in, to what extent do you feel by design, by production, you've been able to foster community through the activities of your foundations? I mean, it's still new here, but it's absolutely happening. We see it around us right now.
Well, I can start, if you would like. And I would use JAX as an example, so we can talk about something tangible. I think when we started looking at JAX at the beginning of 2021, really, as a project, we had an idea of saying we don't want to demolish the old site, which was actually one of the alternatives, but we want to really focus on the regeneration of the site and keep everything that we could. So what you saw today is probably 80% was existing, but was refurbished to create, you know, the basic infrastructure to be able to host a community that we have in today. The reason why I'm going there, because this is my role as a cultural developer, of thinking of creating the basis, the framework for an ecosystem to then thrive. And again, we can only do this if there is a community that can come and own the space and make the space own. So from the very beginning, we wanted to make sure to keep the spaces very simple, to have each own occupant to be able to come in and convert the space to their uses. And I think most of you will know by now that JAX is a much wider site than what you're in today. And this is about 20% of the site that we are in, 18,000 square meter, but the site overall is 130,000 square meter. And it will host not just the Biennale, it will host the Saudi Arabian Museum of Contemporary Art, it will host the JAX Institute for the Arts, the first art school happening in the kingdom, and so many other things. But the key core of JAX is the community. So there was a public process that was launched, and I think it was launched about the end of June. In 24 hours, we received 200 applications for spaces from artists, from fashion designers, musicians, cinema directors, and so that's exactly what is at the base of JAX. Create an infrastructure for people to come in, own their spaces, produce culture, and kind of differentiating from anything that is top-down, you know, planned from above and saying this is what you have to do. We want informality. We thrive in informality. We believe the culture thrives in informality. And if I have to find the final point of this, I believe, my deep belief is the culture is not really about identity, but it's about relations. And relations happen when a community is free to basically mingle and mix, and when we are able to build multidisciplinary approaches from different practices and being able to thrive in a space that is not yet planned. And therefore, some of these people that I see here tonight are actually going to become our first inhabitants, but you know, there are already quite a few, and you guys will be the future of JAX. You know, we don't know what JAX will be in the future, but we will know that it is already the coolest place in Riyadh. So.
Well, I think this is what's so fascinating about what's happening here, and maybe we'll return to it and expand, but institutions in progress and continuously in progress, and all of the potential of that, and the capacity to keep responding to how your audiences evolve and what they may not need anymore and what they may need now. But Mohammed, I wonder if you have something to say? Or?
I think I did, but I kind of forgot the question.
About the sort of driving of if it's necessary to construct or drive culture, or if you've seen through all the initiatives that you've fostered over the years through SAC and through 2139, which is an initiative of SAC, the coming together of community and the sort of appetite for community.
I have to say we were kind of, I think we see ourselves as a very adaptive, dynamic group of people, and having a very focused cultural agenda in a shopping mall. We've launched our first flagship event called 2139. If none of you have been, please join us on the 3rd of March next year. And for those of you who are not familiar, 2139 corresponds to the coordinates of Jeddah. So that's where we're located. And when we launched the first edition, we came across some very interesting community engagement and moments. And one of the most interesting ones was how we sponsored or how we financed the first edition. So we put a nice presentation, went around to all possible sponsors, the banks, the big jewelers, and companies that we thought might be interested in sponsoring an art event. And this was 10 years ago. None of them bought into it. None. Even our closest friends, none. They were CEOs here and there. We went to them, pitched it really hard, poured our hearts out. Nothing. What do? One of the members suggested that why don't we reach out to the families of Jeddah? We do a nice, cute sponsorship package, 50,000 riyals for a couple. We gave them some perks and mentions, and maybe that could work. To our surprise, to our surprise, we actually attracted some 55 families. And not a single corporation came into the sponsorship of that first edition. And it only happened because of the Jeddawis, we call ourselves. They came in, they stepped up, and they made it happen. On the opening night, we had some of our corporate friends come for the opening, and I think we had 3 bankers. And the 3 were like so interested by the vibe and the energy and the interaction. And they were like, oh, no, we want to sponsor. The next one, no, I'm going to sponsor it. And it was like a very, very rewarding bidding war, which ended up with UBS being our bank sponsor. That's one of the kind of community connections that we've developed, and there are many others that we might come across during our talk. I wanted to say one thing, that I really would like to thank everyone who came to hear us tonight. It's a full room, and I know sometimes it's difficult to find the time, so thank you all for coming here.
So to really interrogate the idea of what community is, which is a sort of a ultimately utopian idea, and to think about the difference between audience, which is something that's really critical to the perceived success of institutions and their capacity to secure funding and all these different kinds of things. Can we think about the difference in audience and community? Is there a difference for a place like Jameel Art Centre, for instance, in a city that receives endless tourists and different social groups? Can we think a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, it's our kind of mandate as Art Jameel is to support artists and nurture creative communities. So it's very much, it's a word that we use a lot or maybe overuse. I mean, I'm very interested, picking on what Lucio was saying. I think we can look at the arts as kind of, nurturing the creative industries, which do whether we acknowledge it enough or not, do contribute to the bottom line of a country. We can look at the need for creative expression and see that as an actually fundamental building block of life, and that everyone should have access to that. But we can also think about the arts, particularly in cultures where we work at the moment in the Gulf, which are going through tumultuous changes. If you look at the kind of 3 generations of today's youth, the parents and grandparents, they're living entirely different lives from one another. So going through tumultuous changes while having a very kind of future-oriented vision. So compared to countries in Europe, for example, here, we have Vision 2030. We're actively kind of thinking, where do we want to go? What do we want to be? Same in the UAE as well, this kind of idea of looking ahead to the future and mapping out a future that's coming up. So we need to ask ourselves, what role does the arts play in this, these fast-changing yet future-oriented kind of societies? And I think there's, I'm obviously a little bit sort of biased, but I think there's no other place in public life that gives the capacity to debate, to discuss, to begin to imagine what community and society look like. I mean, in the context of the UAE, are we content to think of society as kind of sequences of parallel ethnicities or fragmented kind of societies that are based on wealth and distance and transparency and this kind of translocation that you mentioned. And same in Saudi, when we're thinking about these massive changes going forward, what role do the arts play in opening up a space to really have a complex conversation about who we are and where we're going? And I think that's really fundamental to the arts, to see the arts as a kind of crucible of thinking that allows for all the complexity and all the unanswered questions that we all have about our kind of future. And this was obviously compounded by the COVID moment, thinking, or which we're still in, are we going to go back to the way we always lived, or are we going to try and change things? Same with the ideas around sustainability and ecology and how we'll live in the future. So the arts has this, really, I think in this context anyway, a really unique capacity to open up that space for debate and should be nurtured in that kind of way. And then how institutions can do that? Well, there's, as we talked about at the beginning, the museum model used to be a very top-down one. I'll display objects and tell you about them, and you'll come and look at them and passively consume them. And if we turn that around and begin to think about kind of active participants in programs, then institutions in a way need to open themselves up to be vulnerable, to actually think about concepts like radical doubt. As the institution, can you actually say, let's talk about this, I don't have an answer, I just have a series of questions, and I invite you in to ask those questions with me? Can you actually open up a space for kind of failure and vulnerability, which then, opens up a kind of door for others to come in? So I think that's really tough, because it's not an easy sale to a funder, or to say, well, we might fail at this, but do you want to come with us on this journey? When the traditional way of judging an institution is kind of fundraising and footfall. How many people came in the building? And how much money did you manage to raise? And if we turn that around to think, well, these many people came in, but maybe there's a way at looking at their depth of experience. Did seeing this film, seeing the Biennale now, did that kind of change your life? Did it make you walk out and think about your life differently? And that's what we're struggling with at the moment, because we have very few mechanisms to kind of measure that sort of depth of experience and depth of change. But we can see it happening all around us. I mean, last night in the Biennale, so many young artists were saying, well, I can't believe this moment. I saw this work. I've never seen anything like this before. And the opening of Hai Jamil was incredible for young people saying, I wanted this all my life, and finally it's here, and I feel I can meet people and have conversations that are really going to change my experience of living day to day. And that's why we all do what we do, but trying to sort of really create ways of exacting real change and also measuring that change are things that we're all questioning still. We don't have the answers. I don't know whether anyone else does here.
But I think that's the most generous, in a way, and boldest position for an institution to take right now, and to embolden audiences to just discard of their timidity, embrace their curiosity, and know that in a way they're partners in this conversation with their local institution is sort of extraordinary. I'm very moved by that approach. And Simon, I wanted to bring you in, because the ways in which you engage your local community, which is an extraordinarily diverse one. You're on You're in the East Village of New York. On the one hand, you've got, I think, Google and Facebook and these massively influential corporations and practiced cultural consumers on your doorstep. You also have a multiplicity of communities, Chinatown, where a lot of people don't speak any English at all, a Hispanic community, and you've been, from what I was reading and research that I was fascinated by, dealing with all sorts of different groups and on some levels, through an exposure to art and a welcoming place to go to experience it, really intervening and helping to redirect the course of some people's lives, maybe not everybody's. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. And then I understand that also, I think we forget, particularly those of us who live in the UAE, and even to an extent here, we had a relatively easy pandemic experience. It was much, much tougher in other parts of the world, and New York as well. And you've been an institution with an enormously successful footfall and in-person audience. So I'm sorry, I'm asking you two questions. Maybe I should allow you to answer the first one. But yeah, how do we now, particularly in I don't know if we can call it a post-pandemic world yet, how do we measure success when it's not about footfall, and who are our audiences besides the people who come through our doors? And we'll have a second part of the digital experience. But if you could first talk about balancing these communities that you work with, and then also the fact that you relocated as an institution. So you had an existing community in one place, your neighbors, and then you've hopefully taken them with you and introduced them to new ones. Sorry for that very, very long question.
No, it's fine. I'll answer to the best of my ability. Thank you. Well, Swiss Institute was historically in Soho. And for those of you who know New York, you know that Soho is a neighborhood of essentially, at this stage, luxury stores. It has become a sort of open-air mall. It's very beautiful. It's a historical neighborhood. There used to be a lot of artists living in Soho, and then prices went up, and it's become, less interesting than it used to be. And Swiss Institute had to relocate as its lease was coming to an end back in 2016. And so we looked at literally 100 buildings across downtown New York. And eventually we looked at a building that was at the corner of St. Mark's Place and 2nd Avenue, which is right in the heart of the East Village, which is historically a neighborhood that has been the first port of call for immigrants and artists. And it was a little bit of a, not contrarian, but an unexpected location for an institution, a contemporary art institution, because there's really not much in that neighborhood. Even though we are, a 10-minute walk from the new museum by Manhattan standards, it's not an easy neighborhood for art. As you said, it is a couple blocks from Facebook and IBM. It's also 1 block from Cooper Union, which is the oldest art school in the United States. But it's also a few blocks from social housing, and it's part of one of the poorest community boards in New York City. New York City has 59 community boards. This is number 3, and it has about 30% of a household with an annual income below $20,000. So when we realized that we were moving from Soho to the East Village, we realized also that we had to be very cognizant of this new reality in order to come in as essentially, good neighbors becoming a generative presence in a new community. What helped tremendously is that we took over a building that had been created in the 50s to be a bank, and it had been a bank ever since. So it went counter to the sort of gentrification narrative that we generally hear. So it was already a good first step, but we moved our offices about a year before we were able to open in the neighborhood. And we set out to get in touch with absolutely every single community organization within a half-mile radius. And New York being very dense, and the East Village having this history of being a neighborhood of immigration, we talked with a lot of people. And instead of saying, hey, we're the Swiss Institute, we're doing contemporary art, it's really great, you should come because, you know, you'll be enlightened by art. We said, well, we do, you know, art things. You guys do tremendous work. Can we participate in one way or another? Is it interesting to you? Can we bring our networks to make, you know, to create inroads toward the creative sphere? Would that be of interest to your constituents? And luckily, the welcome was very positive, and we created a number of partnerships for Swiss Institute, most of which last to this day. So it's been over 4 years now. And we have partnerships with a tutoring organization, with a senior center, with an organization called the Women's Prison Association for formerly incarcerated women. We have a partnership with an organization called Young New Yorkers, which is a diversion program, meaning that for youth that is about to step into the criminal justice system, they are given an opportunity to escape that through you know, dedicated engagement with the arts. And all of those things have been deeply heartwarming for the whole Swiss Institute team. And it has been a wonderful way to get to know the neighborhood and bring people in contact with the arts who had never had the opportunity to do it. And it's not about doing it one time, it's about creating new habits. And I'm very proud to report that we've increased our visitorship by 4 times with our move. And it's not only because of foot traffic.
So it's this constant, in a way, loyal following from these neighbours of yours. And I was really interested in what you were telling us earlier when I was asking you about the sort of generational engagement that you encourage through alternate learning with senior people, which you now mentioned, brings youth and children together with seniors and encourages dynamics that otherwise wouldn't necessarily exist.
Yes, that's true. This is something that we've started recently, which is to start our education programs in a sort of cross-generational way, thinking about why do we do separate programs for seniors and separate for youth. And there's no reason why we should do this all the time. Sometimes it makes sense, but most of the time it doesn't necessarily make sense. And one of the things that sets us apart from most of our museum friends is that our education program is organized solely around the artists from our program. So we do work with teaching artists, people who are professionalizing in education programs for museums, and they're also practicing artists on the side. But what we do is we try to implicate the artists from the program at all times in everything that we do. So you have classes that are taught by, you know, some of today's most forward-thinking artists that bring people from the neighborhood from different age groups, and also thinking about the community, not only in terms of socioeconomic background, but thinking about the linguistic background, the ethnic background, being in a neighborhood that has such a dense network of nationalities. How can we reach out to people who, as you said, don't necessarily speak English? That's also a very interesting thing, coming from the Swiss sort of roots that the institution has without being really Swiss. I'm not Swiss, nobody on the team of Swiss Institute is Swiss, but we have that name that we can use when it's...
It's a neutral name.
Exactly. To some extent, we can use that to our advantage, and it's a very interesting constraint to explore. So we've partnered with the New York Public Library and have been offering classes, video classes during the pandemic, because we had to close for 6 months, which is not the worst, but it was challenging, and we've been able to offer artist talks in languages other than English. And that's been immensely rewarding to see hundreds of people sign up for talks in Mandarin, in Bangla, in Spanish, sort of reflecting the fact that our neighborhood is incredibly international.
The pandemic has been a good inspiration in many ways, particularly for the arts. And touching on the education, the Sheikh Salama Foundation has had an enormous commitment to education for a long time. I mean, it's one of the reasons why you ended up in Abu Dhabi. So we have that commitment to thank for you coming over to our side. Can you tell us a little bit about, and I'm also interested in this cross-generational subject for where we are, because both in the UAE and here in Saudi, there's been an incredibly influential senior generation of artists who've mentored a new generation in the absence of sort of formal education within the arts. But perhaps they've been predominantly in Arabic, and they don't have as much of access to the market. How do we now work between generations, and really which generation leads which generation? Is it, you know, in a very youth dominant part of the world? Is it kids drawing in their parents and other members, elders in their family, or is it the other way around? And can you talk a little bit about how you balance both and the educational element of what you do?
Certainly. I just want to go back to something that I think both Antonia and Mohammed said is still whizzing in my head, and it was around, and I think, Zain, you said sort of it's brave to sort of pose an open-ended question. And that's kind of, you know, when I compare the difference between art and design, you know, design we kind of mistakenly conflate with problem solving. And art we predominantly conflate with asking questions. And it's really hard to ask for money while asking questions. And so, you know, that bravery, I think, is brave, but people don't want to pay for it. And so what you have to do is almost show them. So we kind of need those lunatics that will invest in it first so that we can show them. And I think that's something that, you know, I mean, really, like, not that I'm calling our patron a lunatic, but we've got someone who genuinely believes in, you know, we need to show it. You know, and I think one of the issues for us around this notion of culture, culture's not a thing, it's a happening. And it's happening around us all the time, and we inform culture as well as being informed by it. And so that idea of culture as a dynamic thing is something we're really interested in. And so who is really informing it more than others? And all we can do is gesture into it. And so as a foundation, we make some gestures. Some of those gestures happen to be, we run an emerging artist fellowship for postgraduate level, at a post-bac level, for people to come in and take their art seriously. And part of the thing that we tried to do is also, we're not interested in your first show, we're interested in your 20th show. You know, and that's something that we try and really instill. So part of that is a lifelong learning, because going back to, you know, what is, if culture is a happening, then who are the people that actually spot that happening? It's going back to that accent comment. And so what an artist does is an artist works really long and hard by looking at what's going on around them. And then they work really long and hard to try and show that back to us. And so that's kind of what we're seeing out there at the moment. You know, we're seeing the sort of work of incredibly long staring at the world around, the culture around them, and playing it back to us. Now, in that gesture of playing back, of course, you can't capture the complexity of everything, but you capture certain elements that you, because of your individual background, are now highlighting for an audience or the rest of society to look back on, reflect on. That then goes back and informs society. So, you know, this sort of cyclic process is what we're really involved in. Who's going to inform that is going to be the next generation. It's going to be the older generation. So we do run programs in Warehouse 421 for collectors. We do run programs for audience. What we find is that with these communities, so yes, we have communities of practice, we have communities of art practice, and they are practitioners of art. But we also have audiences. and we also have friends, and we frequently find that friends have more money than communities of practice. And so you can't just cut one community into so many segments, but you have to gesture really differently. And so in the foundation, we try and do a sort of broad brush of that. I was just talking to Luciano earlier about, we're working in our own warehouse district in Mina Zaid and Abu Dhabi. And some of the thinking around it is it has to be by nature anti-disciplinary, but it's got to be about behaviors. And so the behaviors we're interested in are the people that do want to gesture, that are observers, that are making these things, but we also want them resident. So we are making into that neighborhood. So it's somewhere you want, because creativity, culture is not 9 to 5, or 3.5, 4 days a week in UAE at the moment, as we're debating. But it happens all the time, and it's, you know, people are up till 5 in the morning being part of culture, informing it, being informed by it. And so trying to create this space for those sort of gestures is really what we're trying to do. And that's kind of cuts across youth all the way to there's sort of a theory at the moment in terms especially entrepreneurial activity, because the other metaphor and other words that we're putting on top of this is this notion of livelihood. Because I think that's something that as we look at a post-oil economy, this notion of livelihood, it's not just about money, but it's also about the dignity of your work. So we believe strongly artists should be paid. No artist should have to do work for free, especially for large, wealthy brands and developers. And so that notion of livelihood's got to be embedded in it. And so we want people to have a part of their own livelihood so that they get rewarded for their labor, but they also get rewarded for their knowledge. You know, art is a result of an intellectual process as well as a process. So we're trying to embed that into a number of different areas.
Which will also encourage, which will obviously encourage people to pursue a career in creative disciplines if they want one, but will also allow, I'm interested in what you were saying yesterday about losing control, and, you know, you were mentioning now sort of almost an anti-disciplinarian impulse in fostering creative spheres where you are, everywhere really. But we're still in a largely controlled environment, and it's a really exciting thing to consider that when you lose control is when you've sort of arrived at the maturity, the dispelling of timidity, and it's the same thing with artists. You know, if they have the conviction to stick with an observation for those 10 years that you mentioned, waiting for the rest of us to catch up and observe with them. This is really, if we can foster an environment where we make it easier for them to do that along the way, I suppose we've succeeded in building.
It's almost a parenting metaphor, really. You know, as parents, you can't control what your kids are going to do. All you can do is instill the right set of values, and you can create the right environment, and then let their ambition be what they're going to be. And I think that's kind of the role that yes, you're losing control, but you're never really totally losing control, but you're not controlling the situation or the direction. And so, you know, the way we're looking at it is, yes, ultimately they will do something that we don't know. We just don't know what they're going to do. It's kind of like, you know, what's your kid going to do when they grow up? We have no idea.
Well, we have a really healthy balance of independent institutions represented, as well as the support of government. And we're all here with the grace of MOC. And I'm interested in how, particularly here, you were able to, you know, are you working predominantly? I mean, there's a real symbiosis between government support, which has come in massively over the last few years to enable and to accelerate so much of what you've been working on for so long. But does there continue to be, is there a spirit of independent complementarity, or is there an opportunity for real collaboration, advice going both ways? I know that through Art Jamil you've been doing quite there's a lot of conversation back and forth, and of course through SAC and through JAX. Can we touch on that a little bit?
Can I chip in very quickly to
Please.
build on? I think I see two underlying arguments. One is how to build community in space, how to reach out to community, and the second one that probably we haven't really touched upon, which is also what's the role of the digital realm into building community. So on the first one, and I think, I really enjoy talking, as some of you know, so I could talk for this for hours, but trying to be perhaps more pragmatic and talking about strategies to build community in space. One is, for example, what we are part of, which is what the Biennale, the Diriyah Biennale Foundation, led by Aya Bakri, and I see other people here, Dalia, Aki, and other people that are really behind this public program, which is right now we are somehow talking to each other. We're talking to the same community, but if you look at what is going to happen in the public program going forward, it will be reaching out to community that is not generally helped or associated with the hard work. So teaching children, education, having the children that comes in and will start drawing so that people don't find this wall that people in the gallery world try to build. No, I'm kidding, but you're not. On the other side, building on what Simone was saying about the gentrification. Gentrification is the elephant in the room for all urban regeneration projects. We cannot avoid it, but we can plan it. And leading to what you were going to, for example, in JAX we were happy and very fortunate to have a leadership that understood the culture is priceless. And what do I mean with that is that culture doesn't necessarily have to make money. And that's what the government can afford to do. It can potentially be self-sustainable. So for example, JAX is a company that is funded by the Diriyah Foundation that will be able to make profit that is reinvested into the arts and at the same time create very low rent for artists and use instead more market rent for media companies so that there is a crop subvention between the two of them. So that is one of the mechanisms to try to bring more people and try to create a sustainable environment for the longer term, trying to move away from the pressure that the market puts into any of these kind of activities. Secondly, when we talk digitally, which I think is very interesting because it's, we all know it's one of these big ideology of today, disruption, etc. But there is a strong potential. And what I've seen, both in Saudi, but also, High Jamil is a good example, but also around the world, in spaces and that creates a real environment for people, for practitioners to actually produce art. One example that I'm very dear to me is 180 The Strand in London, for example, where the creation of multidisciplinary exhibition, business, meeting artists, and etc. is the fact that there is a creation of a community that spread across the world for the creation of a network that will be associated with each other because of what they do, and not because of what they represent. So it's a sort of a physical social network. And it moves away from the very useful, we're not going to criticize them there, but Instagram, Snapchat, or TikTok of the world, but trying to bring together people, like many of us here, that actually are associated because of what they do, what we believe, and what we produce, and therefore can build together. So the association between space, physical space, and a digital space that builds around what people do, what people create, what people can bring forward collectively. It's a different kind of community that I'm very, personally, very interested in, and I think has a lot of potential for the future to bring forward. And that's why spaces like the Diriyah Biennale, spaces like JAX, spaces like High Jamil, and many other spaces around the world, I think, are going to be fundamental. We are not just moving to a digital space. We still need spaces where we actually create, produce, and meet in person.
Yeah, and we're all hungry for the opportunity to be in the space together and for all of these in-person experiences. But I'm glad you mentioned digital, and as a segue, we inevitably have also developed the appetite and the habit of experiencing whatever we want digitally. And for those of us who might want to revisit or missed a conversation, it'll be available to us, and we sort of know that. And with that in mind, going forward, how much of what your organizations will be doing in your programming is intended specifically for digital audiences. And then again, you know, when we talk about audiences and communities, there are some who have the privilege of visiting very often, and there are others who follow with eagerness and commitment, you know, diasporically. And, you know, there's been so much of what you did, you know, with your micro responses and rapid responses during the pandemic. Yeah, let's talk about digital and the audiences that we have there.
Well, I think, just to pick up on what you were saying, I mean, we're obviously in a part of the world where, you know, if you think about if we're here to serve the Arab world, then who can actually travel within the Arab world, and who actually has the capability to leave their country? And so we've tried to look at it like that, and thinking about serving those communities who don't have the capacity to get a visa to go somewhere, and to put it in really practical kind of terms. And then also the need to develop resources in Arabic. So when we started to develop the High Learning Program, for example, which is this kind of itinerant art school, particularly doing courses in Saudi, you know, artists were coming back to us saying, well, we need resources in Arabic, and we need to be able to trace our own arts histories as well. So the panel that was on earlier today that Dina was chairing, I think was so important, and hopefully there's more of that in sort of telling those stories of Saudi-specific arts histories, so that Saudi artists are able to locate their own practice within their own context, and that there are then resources that they can fall back on for that. So the kind of early awareness or education for us at Art Jamil in this was actually looking at the context of the UAE, where originally, and maybe it's quite similar in Saudi, where school kids were learning about art through books in English about European and American artists, while in the galleries and in the spaces they could go to, they could obviously access artists from their own communities, but without the resources to back up that experience in their own mother tongue. So we started to think about what can we do in that space, and the digital is obviously a prime area for being able to build up those kinds of learning resources and connect people across communities with each other in that kind of learning experience. We shied away, even in the pandemic, actually, from ever doing virtual tours, and we just felt the artists we were working with at that time, you know, they'd made work that was intended to be seen in person, that was highly textural and sensual, and to try and represent that online, we just didn't have the capacity to do that in a meaningful way. So we kind of shied away from that and instead saw the digital as a space for conversation, for debate, for the spread of resources, and to bring people together who are unable to travel. So that became our kind of focus for that. I just wanted, just one other thing to pick up on was just about this idea of reinventing the model. So yeah, here in Saudi, I mean, we're very much hoping that more people will be insane enough to join us in being kind of not-for-profit independent institutions. It's not the easiest route quite yet, but definitely the message we're getting from MOC is that they want to see a kind of broad ecology that sees, you know, the government initiatives like JAX and the Biennale and everything that's being done in that space, which is really incredible, MISC and everything else, alongside kind of more other kind of private or non-governmental, not-for-profits, institutions coming up, and then hopefully a proliferation of artists' organizations, picking up again on that history. So if we look at Saudi or Gulf arts histories and understand the role that artists play through fine arts institutions, through their own informal networks. Earlier someone said, I think it was Her Highness actually earlier on the panel said, well, artists were institutions, and they always have been. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. So artists are institutions, or have been, acted in that role. And institutions can also see themselves as artists and having a sort of practice that develops throughout their lives themselves. So this kind of two-way flow, I think, is really important to look at. And then also just to think about the kind of connections between those histories. Often when you have a moment like this of explosion in an art scene, the art scene of old can sometimes get forgotten, and everyone concentrates on let's make new buildings, let's make new institutions, and somehow the museums of the small towns and the artist institutions that helped each other, or the fine arts societies, get seen as the dusty places of the past, you know. And I think it's really important to try and make those kind of connections and wed one to another, because we wouldn't have what we have now if all those building blocks hadn't been there before, and that history is at risk now of kind of getting lost. But just, sorry, one other very quick thing, which is about reinventing models. So I just think, we have a capacity in this place where we work in the Gulf to really rethink how we want to approach things. We don't need to import anything from anywhere else because we have a chance to think from the ground up what suits us. Do we want an art school model from somewhere else? Or do we actually want our own art school that's maybe in Arabic, that works with artists from here, that reinvents how we see it? Do we want an art school for 18 to 22-year-olds? Or actually do we want a lifelong learning program that you can earn at any age? So I just really think we have a radical moment right now where we can think, what do we want to build that suits here? And how do we do that collectively without necessarily going for a quick fix of, let's get something from London, New York, Paris, mic drop. And that's a sign for me to stop talking.
Well, I think that's the perfect note on which to invite the floor to pose questions to you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing what you do and your insights with us. And thanks to the audience.
Considering it's a little different from your Dubai project, how do you think it affects your programming at Art Jamil in Jeddah, being in a different city that's very different from Dubai? Same sort of question goes to Mohammed with all that's happening in Saudi today. How do you think that affects the programming at SAC? Does it, and if so, how?
That's such a good question. Well, I think always these things, just to go on a slight side note, always these things are about exchange, right? So on your panel, we would, the discussion about artists going from Saudi to other places and learning and bringing back. I'm hoping that someone out there is doing a PhD right now on what happened when artists from all the different Gulf countries traveled abroad. What happened to the artists they met there? Because it's always a two-way influence, right? It's not that Saudis or anyone else from this region went abroad, got the knowledge and brought it back. They also took knowledge from here and left it there. And I'm sure there are artists in art schools around the world who had encounters with artists from this region and it changed their practices. And we maybe don't always look at that influence enough, the other way, And so just in terms of programming for High Jamil, we see it as an entirely different kind of institution. It's a totally collaborative model. As you know, we're all in it together. It's totally multidisciplinary. In a way, we want to go back to that time in the modernist era here where if you said to an artist, I want to know, are you a visual artist, a poet, or a playwright or a set designer? They would say, well, I make art, right? I do all these things, and I don't see one belonging to one discipline or another. So in a way, that's something precious, I think, that's maybe particular to the Gulf or the Arab world, where there was this creative expression in many different formats, which we now see as having some kind of division. So I think High Jamil is picking up on that and thinking, let's cross-pollinate, let's bring the artists together with the filmmakers, the theatre, the comedy performers, and let's see what happens when they all meet together in the Saha, the courtyard, and come together. So it's a very, very different program, and I think what's going to be really interesting is how does that then influence the institution in Dubai? We already see, a bit of an exchange going on, and the team is kind of envious, saying, hey, we did all these amazing things in Jeddah, let's now do this in Dubai. So even 5 days old, we're really beginning to see that influence back. So Saudi is, getting into the UAE mindset, and artists are already kind of, and obviously the whole world is sitting up and taking notice of what's happening right now in Riyadh and the rest of Saudi too. So it's going to be fascinating to see that shift take place and other people learn from us, here.
Thanks for the question. Okay. I've mentioned earlier that SAC is an adaptive organization that was born as a response to a need in a scene. And at the time when SAC was founded, the scene, the void was quite big, and we had to be the agents of different activities across multiple disciplines and offer a lot of programming that honestly was a lot more than what we can do, or we felt that there was a lot of pressure on us to deliver on them. But now that MOCs. MOC has come as one of our supporters and sponsors since the day was created. And now we see Jackson, the Biennale coming and activating in different ways. Hay Jamil is there. And galleries are opening, art schools are into consideration. So the SAC will change its behavior and will definitely look into different gaps, fill up the areas that artists. So we kind of sit in between the artists, the creatives, and the communities and audience. And we want to be a sort of a dynamic, small institution bridge that connects both, and the artists and what they do, the creatives and the messages they want to bring across, the audience on multiple levels and how they want to consume the culture. And in the future, I'm sure SAC will be doing different initiatives. Ones are coming soon and will be announced for next year. Yeah.
Leaving it on a tenterhooks.
I had to.
Are there any more questions from the floor?
Thank you all for this really inspirational contributions which is good for all of us working in the sector. And I have a question. You spoke about the physical space that is very important to create community, and then the digital. But what is with the printed space? So I still feel, and I experienced that always, that, and Antonia, you mentioned your own art history and like Saudi art history. I experienced the same in Southeast Asia. If you want to study Southeast Asian art, you have to go to London, to SOAS, or you have to go to Cornell. This support also of the people who write the history, the support of the art critics or like writing reviews, and that really make it into the world. And I just told to Andrea, I found it so interesting when I met the people from Bidun in the past. And so to really bring a debate, bring a critical discussion with the world, with what's going on here. So I'm really curious is what is planned in that realm, because, I mean, as you said, like if Saudis talk to Saudis, that's very important to develop the confidence, to develop also more knowledge across. But how do you share this and how do you give access? I mean, we are very privileged to be invited to come here, but we are a few, if you imagine how many other communities would be interested in that. And so I'm really curious what kind of outreach in order not to promote, but really to share this moment and to understand better also the art history of this place and of the Gulf at large.
I'd be really interested to hear from everybody else on how can we ever raise any money for publishing? It's the hardest thing. I mean, going back to your question.
It's the one thing that never makes money.
So hard.
But
yeah.
If I may, from a government perspective, because I think the reason why we are all excited here is because the Saudi art scene, the Saudi cultural scene is extraordinarily vibrant. Here there are some of the most talented artists, cultural practitioners, art and writers and etc. that are in the region. So what makes us all, we are not into the importation of foreign models, we are actually into examples and seeing how they will differ once they are really integrated into the ground. One of the key things that we are very focused on, getting to your point, is the documentation of this moment. And so there is, for example, in the project that I'm involved in, which are over 30 projects across the kingdom of urban regeneration, cultural district, cultural landscapes, and so on, is really, we are currently working on a series of research and publication that will come that will really try to understand why certain projects have been brought forward in a certain way to create a witnessing for the future generation. Because if we don't do this, there will be a lot of gap that is going to be very difficult to fill. We are very much aware that currently we are running at a speed that is incredible. Like there's going to be mistakes made, but as quoting a famous playwright, fail again, fail better. And that's our spirit at the moment. We know that we are making mistakes, but at the same time, documenting this, we believe it's very important because it will make us self-reflect on what's happening so that we can continuously try to improve and make sure that we keep into our mind what is the end objective of all of these incredible cultural initiatives that are happening. So definitely, and if you're interested, we can discuss it, there is a very large first of all, there is a publishing, a literature commission that looks after this, but also from our side, there is a very large publishing initiative that we are working on with some international and local publisher. There is a new Saudi publishing house that has been formed at the moment, and one of the things that at least interlap with what I do is really documenting all of this incredible cultural change in the physical aspect of the kingdom.
Just add very quickly, I think we're quite similar to your area of history as well, in that there's not necessarily a traditional way to unearth those. So commercial gallery catalogues, super important. The history of the art scenes in Beirut and other places are really told through commercial gallery catalogues that need to be found and recovered, as well as the more traditional kind of ways of doing things. And I know there are a number of independent projects as well looking at recording the oral histories of the older generation at this time. And at High Jamil we have a library that we're forming as well. So it'll hopefully, but great question.
I'm aware that we started at 7:15 and I thought we started at 7:30. So we've run over, but there's, I think, one more question. I saw Ahmed Zaki. Did you have your hand up? Oh, sir, would you like to pose a
Yes,
question?
my question directly for the Swiss Institute, working in New York, coming to Saudi Arabia, Riyadh particularly, and Jeddah. Where is the links between all of this, please?
Well, there was actually quite a recent link between our Jamil and Swiss Institute that was prompted by the pandemic, where Swiss Institute invited the Kuwaiti artist Alia Farid to curate an exhibition in New York as part of our architecture and design series, and she invited artists from Latin America and Southwest Asia to come together around the legacy of a modernist architect who had designed the public school system for the country of Kuwait. And then we were very lucky to do a public program in partnership with Art Jamil with Abdullah Al-Mutairi, who is also part of the exhibition, and also one of the artists who was taking part in the 89 Plus project, which I co-founded a few years ago with Ansarik Obris, and I was very privileged to have multiple invitations to Dubai from Antonia at the time she was there at the art fair.
And Sarah Abu Abdallah.
And Sarah Abu Abdallah, who's here with her mother, proposing an incredible artwork of transgenerational genius. Yeah, so there are many, many, many links that hopefully will continue in the future.
Well, same, really. I think, and this is obviously, in Riyadh right now, we have this moment where in the coming together of the international community with all of us working in Saudi, which is just really, I think just going back on Sam and Till's point, it's engagement rather than discovery, right? But it's a great moment for people to come together in here in Saudi and see what's happening.
Did you have a question?
Yes. Thank you,
Hi.
everyone. Two quick questions. The first one is, just forgive my ignorance, what is SAC and JAX? Just for those of us who don't understand, I'm really sorry. No, I appreciate, because I think this is actually a result of you guys have actually built a community. The communities result in having abbreviations. So hopefully we'll join the community and we'll understand the abbreviations soon. That's the first question. Second is, what would you say, this question is specific to the non-Saudi panel, what makes the Saudi art world unique to the rest of the world? I'd like to know as a Saudi, what do you see? Because you've been all over, you've been to New York, I think it's really exciting for me as a Saudi seeing what's happening, but I'd love to know your perspective. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer about JAX. So first of all, and that connects to the way the urban regeneration works. JAX, for the one that you are not aware of, is the name of a company that built the infrastructure on this side of Riyadh in the 80s. And yes, and it used to build some of these warehouses we are in to actually deposit the material. So we thought it was a great name because it connected to a sort of an industrial heritage, and we kept it. And that's what spurred probably your question. SAC, I'll leave it to Mohammed.
Thanks, Lucio. SAC stands for the Social Art Collective. And we see ourselves as, we've converted from, when we first incorporated SAC, we incorporated as a limited liability company, claiming that we are non-for-profit. And thank God a lot of our friends and sponsors believed us and gave us their funds. But on paper, we were a for-profit company. And we just converted, because of the changes of the systems and the ease of entering the social and institutional governance, we converted our company to a social enterprise. And now we're called the Social Art Collective.
One more.
Well, there was a second answer, which is, I think you see it yourself, guys. It's extraordinary. First of all, there is a huge momentum, but there is a lot of talent that has been somehow undercover for a long time. So here, I think a lot of us know that there is a real underground ongoing. You know, it's not just to be underground is easy. This is something that for many of us, for many of you, sorry, has been a struggle for a long time, and the creativity is tremendous. Plus, coupled with a real demographic bonus. I mean, 60% of the population is under the age of 35, and so we have millions and millions of young Saudi there. You know, this moment is an historical moment. Out of all of this effort, I can only wonder what will happen. It's extraordinary. I think we all are thrilled to be part. I'm very privileged and very honored to be part of this.
Thank you all. It's been a long, exciting day after another long, exciting day. So grateful for you staying with us and listening and for all your interest and questions. Thank you to the amazing panel for your insights and for all your time.
Thank you, Zain.